Today, we are going to look at two different types of word problems and demonstrate and explain the process of one, uncovering word problem structures, and two, representing relationships between quantities using strip diagrams. The concepts covered in this video are expected to be mastered by the third grade on the vertical alignment chart. The first word problem we are going to look at today is, Rachel had some books. Jalen gave her 6 more books. Now she has 12 books. How many books did Rachel have to start? To begin the problem, we are going to start with determining what kind of structure this problem is. We are familiar with the start, change, and result chart, so we are going to use right now. However, this time the arrow is missing. I'm going to leave it up to you to determine which way the arrow should be going. Let's start with the start section. Rachel had some books, so that means we're not sure what she started with, so I'm going to put a question mark labeled books in the start section. And let's continue reading. Jalen gave her 6 more books, so we know that the change section is 6 books. Let's continue. Now she has 12 books, so we know that the result is 12 books. So I'm going to put 12 books in the results bubble. Now let's go back to figure out which way the arrow should be facing. The problem says Jalen gave Rachel 6 more books. So that means the arrow should be pointing towards the start. And since the arrow is pointing towards the start, we know that this is a join problem since we are adding to the start. So since we know what kind of structure this is now, let's use our strip diagrams to solve for the amount of books that Rachel started with. Since we know that what our result is, let's start with that piece first. This long piece represents the 12 books Rachel has now. I'm going to label this Rachel's 12 books. This smaller piece represents the amount of books that Jalen gave her. So I'm going to label this 6 books. And this other smaller piece represents the amount of books that Rachel started with. And since we're not sure what that total is, or what that number is, I'm going to label that with a question mark labeled books. We can solve this problem 2 ways. We can try to find the missing add-in, so 6 plus what number equals 12, or we can solve by using subtraction. 12 minus 6 equals what? Let's start with the add-in, the missing add-in. 6 plus blank equals 12. We know that 6 plus 6 equals 12, and to check that, we can use subtraction. 12 minus 6 equals 6. So we know Rachel started with 6 books. The second word problem that we're going to solve today is, Jonah has 10 pennies. Kennedy has 7 pennies. How many more pennies does Jonah have than Kennedy? To begin this problem, we're going to start by determining what kind of structure this word problem is. We're familiar with the 4 different structure types. Let's reread the problem one more time. Jonah has 10 pennies. Kennedy has 7 pennies. How many more pennies does Jonah have than Kennedy? This isn't a join or separate problem because we are not adding or subtracting a change from the start to create a new result. In addition to that, we are not putting together a part and a part to create a whole, so that means that this must be a compare structure. This is a compare structure because we are trying to determine the difference between the amount of pennies Jonah has and the amount of pennies Kennedy has. Even though we are familiar with our compare model, we can refer to it as a review. We start with a large set, which in this case would be Jonah's 10 pennies. Then compare it to the small set, which would be Kennedy's 7 pennies. Then we would solve for the difference, which is the piece identified with the question mark. Now, we're going to use our strip diagrams to solve for how many more pennies Jonah has than Kennedy. First, we're going to start out with the large set. So here's a strip that represents Jonah's 10 pennies. I'm going to label that Jonah's 10 pennies. Now we will place the small set, which represents Kennedy's 7 pennies. So I'm going to label that Kennedy's 7 pennies. Now that we have both of our sets that we are comparing, we need to solve for the smaller piece known as the difference. And since we're unsure of what the difference is, I'm going to label that with a question mark labeled pennies. In order to find the difference, we're going to subtract the small set from the large set. So, Jonah's 10 pennies minus Kennedy's 7 pennies. So, 10 minus 7 equals what? 10, we know that 10 minus 7 equals 3. And to check our math, we can turn that into addition. 7 plus 3 equals 10. So we are right. So that means Jonah has 3 more pennies than Kennedy. You have successfully uncovered 2 various problem structures as well as solved them using strip diagrams.